Welcome to the Working on Wellbeing podcast by the World Wellbeing Movement. The podcast that allows you to be a fly on the wall during conversations with the world's leading wellbeing experts. I'm your host, Sarah Cunningham, and today's episode is a truly special one. We'll hear from the pioneer behind the Blue Zones project, which researches those extraordinary areas on our planet where people live longer, healthier and happier lives. And we'll explore how the findings from that research can help governments and world leaders to prioritise the well-being of people. But before I introduce our incredible guest, I first want to take a moment to thank our series sponsor, S&P Global. The world's leading organisations rely on S&P Global for the essential intelligence they need to make confident decisions. S&P Global, powering global markets. Now, I could not be more excited to be talking to today's guest. This is a really big and important episode. At the World Wellbeing Movement, we believe that the overarching goal of governments across the world should be the well-being of people. And we've had some incredible guests already on this podcast talking about the importance of well-being public policy. But today's guest is truly extraordinary. Dan Buettner is a National Geographic Fellow, a best-selling author, an award-winning journalist and filmmaker, and he is the founder of the Blue Zones project, which has researched those incredible areas of the world where people live longer, healthier and happier lives. And that research is so important. Not only can it help all of us individually, but it also provides actionable insights that governments and world leaders can take on board to inform future public policy so that governments can prioritise the well-being of people. I am so excited to jump into this conversation. Dan Buettner, you are so welcome.
Thank you so much. And after that incredibly generous introduction, I have to admit I'm in a cheesy hotel in Rome after flying all night. So if I'm not my usual tsunami of charm and useful information, you'll forgive me ahead of time.
Of course. And my goodness, I'm fairly sure that hotels after work travel have not made the top 10 list of recommendations in your Blue Zones research. But who knows? Maybe some of the incredible food in Italy might be good. So hopefully I'll get some nice dinner tonight. But listen, a lot of our listeners are going to be really familiar with you. I certainly really enjoyed watching your Netflix documentary and then reading your book. And I know many of our listeners will have too. But there will be some who won't have got around to it yet. So can I ask you to define what is a blue zone?
So a blue zone is a geographically defined, demographically confirmed area where people live the longest. And it was originally a National Geographic project assignment. And we were able to sort of circumvent other areas that had been beleaguered by age exaggeration or fraud, because we actually, in each of these places, looked at birth records that date back to 1850, cross-referenced them to birth certificates and even baptismal records. And then we followed those people till death. So either saw their death certificates, their gravestones, or we went and visited them. So the reason that Blue Zones has stood the test of time is because we carefully verified these areas for having the highest concentration of people over 90. And we found the longest lived men in Sardinia, Italy, the longest lived women in Okinawa, Japan, on the island of Ikaria, Greece, a population that lives about 8 years longer, largely without dementia. Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, lowest rate of middle age mortality. So people there have the best chance of reaching healthy age 90. And then in the United States, among the Seventh-day Adventist. And because only about 20% of how long we live is dictated by our genes, the other 80% is something else. We argue that these blue zones offer the best environment or the best set of characteristics to help the rest of us live out I think the promise of this biological machine, our bodies, than any place else in the world.
Wow. So the Blue Zones is giving us all of this incredible insight. And as I mentioned in my introduction, that's really valuable. Those insights can help world leaders to really change the shape of public policy. But let's leave world leaders for a minute and let's stay with each of us individually. Most of us don't live in Blue Zones areas. What are the top 3, 4, maybe 5 very practical steps that all of us, no matter where we live in the world, can take to improve our own longevity and vitality?
So if you look to what people in the blue zones have done over time, there's some very clear patterns. So if you want to know what a 100-year-old, for example, ate to live to be 100, you have to know what she's eaten her entire life as a little girl, middle age, and lately. And to get at that, we aggregated dietary surveys done over the past 100 years in all 5 blue zones. And what emerges is a almost entirely whole food, plant-based diet. They did eat meat, but meat was a celebratory food for them, usually pork, by the way, a little bit of chicken. But about 5 times a month, they ate meat, on average, traditionally speaking. But mostly what they're eating are carbohydrates, which I think alarms a lot of the carbophobes out there. They're eating mostly whole grains, greens, the type of stuff we'd weed whack from the side of the road often, garden, and also including garden vegetables, tubers like sweet potatoes, nuts, and the cornerstone of every longevity diet in the world is beans. If you're eating a cup of beans a day, it's worth about 4 extra years of life expectancy. But also what we find, there's this $82 billion anti-aging industry that has failed to give us even one pill or supplement or nostrum that's shown to slow aging in humans. But what we clearly see in blue zones and elsewhere around the world, that people who have a strong sense of purpose live about 7 years longer than people who are rudderless. That people who are surrounded by 3 to 5 friends they can count on a bad day, those people are living 8 years longer than people who are lonely in the world. And people live in environments where they're nudged into moving. Walkable communities, for example, those people live somewhere between 3 and 5 years longer than people who are sedentary. So Blue Zones gives us some very clear, and many of them right under our noses, but largely under celebrated ways for us to very easily add extra years without costing us money.
And I love these tips. And I have to confess, my husband and I first watched the Blue Zones documentary about a year ago. Our intake of beans has amplified a lot. So my poor husband keeps getting served, I made another butterbean cassoulet, which I don't think I had ever made before I watched your documentary.
I'm so happy.
And so look, that's maybe one of the easier ones to apply. But the reality is we live in an always on, very fast-paced world. Many of us are juggling multiple responsibilities. So we can start the year with great intentions and say, well, I'm going to cook more home-based food, I'm going to cook more plant-based food, and I'm going to do more exercise and movement. But it can be difficult to stick to that. What do you say to people who would say, look, this is all very well, but actually it's not achievable in this fast-paced world of ours?
Well, I guess I would inject some optimism into the situation. And we choose the lives we have. I think we have more say over our lives than we think we do. We don't have to take the job we're doing in most cases. We don't have to live in the neighborhood we're living or choose all the social responsibilities or opportunities presented in front of us. And I think part of Blue Zone's work is to help people understand that they can shape their surroundings so that they're not as stressed out or not as tempted by the unhealthy things or not moving as fast as we are. So, I think Blue Zones has delivered two important insights. The first set of insights, as I wrote in my book, The Blue Zones, 9 Secrets for Living Longer, are what people in the longest lived areas do. What's most important, I think, is how to do them. We live in a society or in a marketing environment that is constantly trying to sell us the notion that there's a quick fix for living longer, a superfood, a diet, as you alluded to, anti-aging, a longevity hack of some sort, etc. But what we see in Blue Zones, places where people are manifestly living about a decade longer at middle age and reaching age 100 to 10 to 15 times greater than the United States, they're not doing anything consciously. They're not deciding for themselves or mustering some sense of individual responsibility that they're going to get healthier. In fact, they probably have less, quote unquote, discipline than most of us. The insight here is that these people are living longer because they live in an environment that engineers their unconscious decisions, not their conscious decisions. We focus a lot on trying to change our conscious decisions, but rather their unconscious decisions on a day-to-day basis are slightly better when it comes to what they eat or how much they move or how they socialize or how they manifest their purpose. Slightly better every day for decades or a lifetime. And that's what's giving them this enormous longevity edge.
And so what can all of us do? I mean, we may want to pack up and move to Sardinia, and I have to say I wouldn't mind, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. You've talked about small adjustments that we can all make to our own environments to nudge us more. Can you give us some examples of those?
Yes. So I wrote a book called The Blue Zone Challenge, which aggregates about 30 evidence-based ways we can set up our immediate environment so we unconsciously make better decisions. And I'll give you a few of them. We consume about an extra 200 calories a day without thinking about it. And those are largely unconscious decisions. For example, people who have a toaster on their counter tend to weigh about 2 kilos more after 2 years than people who don't have a toaster. Why is that? Because most of us eat a seafood diet. We eat the food we see. Yeah. And a toaster reminds us often to eat things that aren't all that healthy for us. In other words, what we put in toasters usually aren't all that healthy. Having a junk food drawer out of the way, putting a fruit bowl in the middle of your table and having it well lit. These are things that actually over time nudge us towards much healthier and less food than trying to remember, this healthy snack or whatever. Another thing that seems to work is curating our social environment, proactively adding people to our immediate circle whose idea of recreation is walking or playing tennis or riding their bikes, people who care about us on a bad day, adding people who eat healthy. It's not a bad idea to have a vegetarian or a vegan in your immediate social circle because they're going to teach you how and where to find healthy plant-based food. So, there's a few ideas right there.
And community really jumped out there, and community has really jumped out in your research. What else can we all do to really increase that sense of community? Because in some ways, technology has maybe made us less social. Are there things that you would recommend everybody do to become more a part of their community?
Well, number one, volunteering. I wrote this other book called The Blue Zones of Happiness, and looking at worldwide data from the World Poll. I know you know that well. Around the world, people who volunteer report higher levels of life satisfaction. They also tend to have lower healthcare costs and lower rates of BMI. So, very easy way to augment your social circle is volunteer at a place that shares your values. And a nice byproduct of that is the people you meet are likely to share your values and more likely to become long-term friends. But we spend every year north of $100 billion on diets. And if you look at the half-life of diets, it's about 3 months. In other words, if you start with 100 people today on a diet, you have 50 in 3 months, and you have 25 in 6 months. And after about 2 years, you're down to under 5%. If you took that same effort and resources and focus and just went into your own address book and tried to identify a handful of people you already know who are healthy and who are engaged with the world and eat right, and said to yourself, I am going to make an effort to spend more time with them. I'm going to invite them to dinner. I'm going to ask them out for coffee. I'm going to say, let's go do a walk together. I mean, really proactively. There's an idea known as propinquity. The more time we spend with somebody, the more likely they are to become a friend. So if you just rotely begin with, I'm going to reach out to these people, this handful of people who I want to build immediate community with, and see them 5 times, the chances of them becoming a real friend is very good. And why is this important? Because we know that if our 3 best friends are obese and unhealthy, there's a 150% better chance we'll be overweight. Alcohol abuse, contagious. Drug use, contagious. But so are healthy behaviors. Eating plant-based, contagious. Being physically active, contagious. Even happiness is contagious. If we bring happy people into our immediate social circle, for every new happy person, we're 15% more likely to be happy ourselves. And why don't we hear this all the time, even though there's good research to show that curating the right community works? Because there's no money in it. Marketers aren't constantly hounding us to do these things because they can't make money. But the history of the human race and the research that your institute and institutes around the world will show that being socially connected with the right people is arguably the best strategy, not only for longevity, but for happiness too.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually had, I'm sure you know him well, Professor Robert Waldinger on a previous episode.
He's a good friend.
I had a feeling you were good friends, all right. And yeah, I mean, again, very similar research around happiness. But what's so lovely is adding on not just the happiness, but if I go for a walk with a good friend out in the countryside, it's not only going to improve my happiness, but my longevity. So you've given us some really interesting insights that we can all apply individually. But you are one of a growing number of wellbeing science experts who believe that actually traditional measures of societal progress, like GDP or gross domestic product, which is essentially economic growth, are not necessarily the best measures of societal progress. So we've had some really interesting guests on this show before, like Professor Lord Richard Layard, who I know you know,
Yes.
and Lord Gus O'Donnell, who've talked about the importance of governments putting well-being at the heart of their policy making. What's your view on the role that governments should play when it comes to the well-being of people?
So GDP is important, but it's a blunt instrument. It doesn't provide. You can't just hit a country with high GDP and expect people to be happy. In other words, but So GDP is one of the 4 or 5 things that really determine happiness in nations. Another really big predictor is healthy life expectancy, equality. Turns out that equal nations are happier than unequal nations controlling for everything else. Trust, being able to trust your neighbors, etc. So the problem is we become obsessively focused on growing GDP, especially in the United States here, or growing wealth. And at a certain point, the power of incremental wealth doesn't deliver much more happiness, and the costs associated with this sort of blind pursuit becomes greater, especially for the least fortunate. I'm a big believer. Number one, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And number two, you end up achieving what you try to improve measurably. And if you want a very rich country, you can achieve that. But if you want a happier country, you have to focus on different things. And I try to focus on the latter.
So you said, and actually that's a mantra that we use a lot, you cannot manage what you don't measure. So I'm based in the UK. Obviously from my accent, you can tell I'm Irish. Both countries, the UK and Ireland, measure population wellbeing. So in the UK, they measure, obviously you're very familiar with the Office for National Statistics and the life satisfaction question, which is similar to the question in the Gallup World Poll, which essentially asks, on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? Do you see a balance between life satisfaction and longevity? And in the countries you've looked at, actually, those people who are living longer, are they also having increased life satisfaction throughout their life?
So, well, I'm pretty sure everybody quotes him, but Ed Diener found that if you can manage your way into the top quintile, or the 20% of the happiest people, it's worth about 6 extra years of life expectancy over being unhappy. And, some of that's genetic, but not all of it. In blue zones, when you look at worldwide life satisfaction data, people who live in blue zones happen to live in the top 20% quintile. And I would argue it's closer to the top 10% in the blue zones themselves. So the beauty of a blue zone's approach to longevity, as opposed to quote unquote longevity hacks, stem cells or rapamycin or metformin or all these other sort of douchey things that people in Silicon Valley do, is it doesn't just prolong a shitty life. It seems that a blue zone approach, you actually enjoy the journey. People in blue zones are living a long time because they live close to nature. They grow their own food. They walk to their neighbors' houses. They sit down and eat dinner with their family. They have a spiritual life. They go to festivals. They're not on their devices all the time. And these are things we know drive happiness, but they also seem to drive longevity. And it's a beautiful confluence.
So if more governments were to put people's well-being first, what would be the first 2 or 3 policies that you think might change?
Well, I think how much we socialize with our neighbors, or the chances that we're going to create meaningful relationships, is very much a function of our environment. In the United States, we have these suburbs. People live in cul-de-sacs with these enormous yards and no sidewalks. And every time you go anywhere, you have to get in your car. The chances of serendipitously running into somebody and having a casual conversation enough times that it grows into a meaningful relationship are very low, as opposed to, say, living in, I'm just going to pick a city that I happen to profile, Boulder, Colorado, where the city planners intentionally made it more difficult to drive across the city than to walk or bike. So the sidewalks, the wide sidewalks and the outdoor cafes and the trees that shade the streets invite people to come out and walk and sit down and have a cup of coffee together. And it's no coincidence that controlling for ethnicity and income, Boulder is far happier than, say, a Tallahassee, Florida, or a Kentucky suburb, where people are going from their attached garages into their cars and then through fast food takeout lines and then to their underground garages at work.
And it's really interesting that you're talking about, actually shaping that environment at that local authority level. I believe you have now got a Blue Zones certification. Can you tell me more about the Blue Zone certification?
It's actually not a certification. It is a solution. So Blue Zones project are citywide efforts. We are endorsed by the local government, and we're paid by insurance companies or hospital systems in the United States to lower healthcare costs measurably, which is usually done by lowering BMI, and to increase life satisfaction on the population level. And the way we achieve that is we bring entire teams into a city. So a team of 1 million people, we have a full-time staff of 25 people. Gallup measures us going in. We get a baseline for BMI and WBI, they call it, it's a well-being index that uses the same metrics that you guys use. And we're paid as a function of how we improve the health and well-being of the city. And we do that with 3 teams. The first team comes into the city with policy bundles. And if you can think of a menu, we aggregate menus of best practice policies that favor healthy food over junk food, that favor the cyclist and the pedestrian over the motorist, that favor the non-smoker over the smoker, and other policies we know that have occasioned higher well-being elsewhere. And we meet with city council, who's already said, come on in, we want you, and the mayor. And we have a consensus process where the only thing they have to do is engage with us to go through each of these evidence-based policies to evaluate them for, number 1, feasibility, and number 2, effectiveness in our community. And in each of these policy bundles, we get a half a dozen policies that float to the top, where everybody in the room, private and public sector, are shaking their head. Yes, we can do that here, and yes, it would make a difference. And then my team's job is to make sure it's implemented and enforced or brought to fruition. The second thing our team does is administer a Blue Zone certification for restaurants, grocery stores, workplaces, schools, and churches. And once again, we help these places change their policies and their designs for evidence-based ways for people to move more mindlessly, eat better, socialize more, and know and live their purpose. And again, this is done mostly through policy and environment. And then the third team within each of these cities works with about 15% of the city's individuals to shape their homes and their social lives so that they're moving more and eating better and socializing more. And this is all done largely at the Adam Smith silent hand level. We're not ramrodding them into doing something they don't want to do. We're setting them up for success, making it easier for them to do the right thing, harder to do the wrong things, and then we just sit back and measure, and guess what? It works every time.
So do you have a particular area which is your biggest success story from taking this approach?
Well, numerically, I would say it's the beach cities of Los Angeles, where Gallup has been measuring for 10 years, and they've seen a double-digit drop in BMI, which is to say obesity, a double-digit drop in smoking, which saves a lot of money and also smokers tend to be happier as well, and a significant rise in life satisfaction.
And
Um,
just so non-smokers tend to be happier.
yes,
Yeah.
it's actually a causative relationship. That, in other words, if you quit smoking, you're way more likely to be happy. Um,
So if anybody's listening and thinking about quitting smoking, there's straight away an extra reason. Yeah.
there's also a causative relationship between obesity and financial security. So, in other words, if you can make yourself more financially secure, save more, and get involved in insurance schemes and lower the sort of financial risk you're living, you're going to weigh less over time, or at least a population of people who do that are going to weigh less. Um, but I would say, at the end of the day in the United States, our the economies of healthcare are not set up behind keeping people healthy. And in fact, the alignments here are behind making sure people get sick and then making money off of selling them drugs or procedures or doctor's visits or hospital beds. And that's just a sad state of the economics of health in the United States. So we have to also play in that arena. We have to, in other words, we don't have to make people sick, but we have to show that keeping people healthy can be um, uh, profitable. And in our biggest success is in Fort Worth, Texas. About 1 million people, and over a 5-year period, we dropped the BMI by about 3% at the population level. At least the city gives us credit for that. And it has occasioned, according to Gallup's economist, about $250 million in annual healthcare savings. And based on these kinds of results, we're able to get our work paid for. So we don't rely on taxpayer dollars or the government. We have to earn our keep.
But I think this is, again, a really important insight for government leaders right across the world, which is if you can, put well-being first in public policy, help people in improving, their life satisfaction, their well-being. Actually, first of all, it saves the government money on potentially future medical costs, future hospital costs. You tend to see, greater employment. An awful lot comes with that. What would your advice? Because are you doing that blue zone solution outside of the US, or is it just in the US now?
We're just doing it in the United States now, not because we wouldn't do it elsewhere, but uh, it's just, it's expensive work, and people they they don't understand that unless you bring trained people who are mentored by a national team, and you can make a 5-year commitment. You have to pay people a competitive wage. They need an office, and you need to be there for long enough to make a difference. It isn't just a rubber stamp where you come in rah 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 and then hope people will keep doing it. It requires a sustained effort, and we haven't found any European government who wanted to take that sort of a challenge on, but it could be done anywhere. And I'll tell you, the only way it works is if a government says, all right, we're not going to just measure GDP. We're going to actually measure well-being or life satisfaction at the population level. And then we need somebody who's smart enough to correlate policy with increased well-being. And a lot of them are counterintuitive. And a lot of them you wouldn't necessarily spend money on if you didn't realize it. A walkable street. People tend to think, no, 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 I want to drive quickly to my job. I want high speed limits, and I want wide lanes, and I don't want to have to stop for anything. Well, that creates an environment that favors the car, but it makes a horrible living environment for the human beings because they're at greater danger of being hit and killed by a fast moving car. There's more noise, which human beings don't like. It makes them nervous. The air is poorer, which is clearly associated with higher rates of asthma. People are less likely to stop and walk into stores. People don't want to walk in that environment. So people think they want A, but actually it's B that delivers more happiness. And it usually requires enlightened leadership to be able to say no to the immediate wants of people who are voting for them for the greater good in a few years by, creating a walkable city, for example.
Well, listen, very quickly, from cities to the workplaces, quite a quick question here. What can we learn from blue zones about how people work? And how can we take that insight and improve our approach to our work-life balance?
So the number one driver of whether or not an employee likes his or her job is not how much they get paid, not if there's, free cappuccino or whatever at the break stations. It's whether or not they have a best friend at work. Now, if I'm the CEO of a company and I have that insight and I'm interested in retaining my employees and making them more productive, I'm going to create a program that tries to connect my employees in a meaningful way. So at Blue Zones, we take this insight and we create what we call MOIs. And it usually requires a bit of investment, not a big investment from the employer. We need to get everybody together in a room, and we have a process by which we help people cluster up in groups of 5 people who share values, who share interests, and who share a schedule. And then we just need 10 weeks of a little bit of time each week to allow them to eat together or walk together. And it's amazing. We can usually create 60% of those, 60 to 70% of those people will make a long-term friend, which almost costs me nothing, really. Well, another thing is, if you go through the workplace and you look at all the kind of junk food nodes, which are making my employees fat and unhealthy, and eliminate them, it doesn't cost much money. For example, you don't need vending machines full of sugar-sweetened beverages. People complain for a little bit, but you take those out or replace it with water. There's often a snack area where people work that are full of crumpets and donuts and cookies and candies and salty chips. Well, there are employers that say, no, we're not going to have these in our workplace. And they set guidelines for fruits or nuts. And, after a while, people don't miss the junk food. So if you meticulously go through the work environment and make it healthier for people to eat, you get a big change after a year. So those are a couple of Blue Zones ideas.
Well, Dan, I've loved hearing your ideas. I'd love to finish with a rapid fire round, if that's all right. And these are just the really quick questions. But the first one is, what are your daily rituals to look after your well-being?
I sleep 8 hours. My first meal of the day is at noon, and I eat a Sardinian minestrone instead of eggs or bacon or cereal or something like that. I take a nap every day. I happen to be social, but I take social interaction like a vitamin. Every day, I take time with 3 or 4 friends who I care about. I intentionally live in a walkable community. I live right by the sea in Miami Beach, so I either swimming or walking or biking every single day. And for me, health is effortless. It's fun, in fact.
Wow. Well, I shall be Googling a Sardinian minestrone recipe after this. If you could time travel and you could go back and give advice to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give that young man?
You're on the right path.
Oh, I love that. Now hop back in your time machine, because I want you to travel 30 years in the future. What is the change that you would like to see when you land 30 years in the future?
I want to live in a blue zone. Personally, or for the whole world?
For the whole world. How can we increase the number of blue zones in the world?
Absolutely. And it's not hard, by the way. Honest to God, I think the biggest change, if every city had a double bottom line. A, you have to get reelected, but B, you have to measurably increase the well-being of that city. We would have a healthier world and a happier world.
So in order to get elected, we need our leaders to prove that they can improve the well-being of the city. Is that what you're saying?
They need to try. They need to try, and that should be a major sort of scorecard. Their scorecard should not just be, did we collect more taxes or create more business opportunities? Did the people in this community increase their own life satisfaction? And if the answer is yes, you get back in. And if the answer is no, well, you're on probation. Show us what you're going to do for the next term. I guarantee you we will have a healthier, more thriving world.
And Dan, I don't know if you've seen this research, but one of my colleagues, Dr. George Ward, have you seen his research? So he did some research which actually showed that the biggest indicator of whether a current administration will get re-elected is, in fact, the happiness of people.
I do believe that, and there are outliers, but and that's encouraging research.
Yeah, it really, really is. Well, we need lots more research, like your incredible research and all of your colleagues. I know you've done us a huge favour by joining us today, and I know you're a bit tired because you've just flown transatlantic, I think. And so I just wanted to say a huge thank you. You said one of your daily rituals is, a nap and looking after yourself. So I do hope that you're going to take some time off now.
Normally I'm brilliant, but yeah, you're right. I did fly all night. If any of your listeners have any lingering questions, I'm at Dan Buettner on Instagram, and I answer them all. They can direct message me, and really enjoyed talking to you. You guys are doing arguably the most important work in our world, and I thank you for the movement, and I thank you for inviting me to add my voice to the chorus.
Thank you, and thank you to all of so many people who are doing all of this great work. It's wonderful to see you, Dan, and thank you so much.
All right.
Okay.
See you when you're 100.